Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to you. The theme of my lecture tonight concerns paintings by Piet Mondrian which originate between 1963 and 1996, at least as far as we can ascertain on the basis of the dating on the pictures themselves. As you can see, these paintings are exhibited on the wall here behind me. What we have here are 6 paintings characteristic of one of the most important artists of this century, an artist whose name, rightly or wrongly, has become synonymous with the very idea of abstract art. However, before we proceed to an analysis of the paintings themselves, I think it might be a good idea if we listened to what Mondrian himself had to say about his art. Among various possible directions, says Mondrian, there are only 2 basic possible directions, horizontal and vertical. Among various possible light values, there are only 3 basic colors possible, white, gray, and black. Explaining how he arrived at these pictures, he says, in the first pictures, the space was the background. I began by marking out the forms in detail. Verticals and horizontals became rectangles, but they still appeared as forms separated from the background, and the color was still unclear. Feeling a lack of unity, I brought the rectangles closer. The space became white, black, or gray. The form became red, blue, or yellow. Linking up the rectangles corresponded to the expansion of the verticals and horizontals on the whole composition. It was clear that the rectangles, like all individual forms, stood out, and that therefore they had to be neutralized in respect to the composition. However, he goes on, the rectangles are never an end in themselves, but the logical consequence of lines continued into the space which determines them. They arise spontaneously from the intersection of vertical and horizontal lines. Otherwise, the rectangles, if they are applied on their own without adding some other form, do not appear as individual forms, because their contrast with the other forms does in fact cause a difference. Later, with the aim of cancelling the accentuation of the designs and rectangles, I abolished color and emphasized the border lines, intersecting them one over the other. Not only were the designs obliterated and cancelled, their relationship became more active. The result is an increase in expressive dynamism. Even in this case, too, I experienced how important it is to remove individual forms, which is the first preparation for universal construction. By continuing the process of abstraction, in which the large square predominates, 2 processes which will completely mature can be perceived. The first is the harmonious division of the surface, which is arrived at by reducing the whole surface to 2 succinct images, squares and horizontal and vertical rectangles, which arise from extending the peripheral lines. The other is the ever-increasing importance of lines as the main factor in the picture. Thus, the main and structural role of the line is emphasized. Its function is no longer to border a geometrical image, which is no longer closed, but appears in the form of open, spacious parts. And although it is negative, the background thus again gains importance. It will almost always be uniformly white or gray as a chromatic definition of the space. Well, that's what Mondrian himself has to say about his pictures, and it looks as though one couldn't add anything at all to that explanation. But is this, in fact, the case? The first thing that might seem extremely unusual to us is the very presence of Mondrian paintings here in this lecture hall. You may well be asking, how come we have so many Mondrians present in this room? I'm sure it must seem almost unbelievable to the majority of you. Now, if we could believe that for one moment, by some miracle, it had been possible to get original Mondrians for this occasion, we would soon be puzzled by the data we find on the paintings themselves. If you take a careful look at them, you can see that they do indeed carry Mondrian's signature, but the dating on them seems a little strange, to say the least. Namely, these pictures are dated 63, 79, 83, 86, 92, and 96. This means that the oldest picture is dated 1963. So what now? We know that Mondrian did in fact live from 1872 to 1944. We can assume that what we have in front of us are not original pictures by Mondrian. Even if we assume that, for some reason unknown to us, the artist himself dated or post-dated his pictures in this way, it would be possible to confirm by scientific analysis that these paintings did in fact originate after Mondrian's death. And that means that what we have in front of us are not paintings by Piet Mondrian. A new question therefore arises. Who is the real author of these pictures? We could, for example, assume that these are paintings done in the style of Mondrian by some contemporary painter who is unknown to us. But if you look at the literature, and you can take my word for this, you can establish that these are indeed faithful copies of a Mondrian original. Thus, these two, for example, are copies of a Mondrian in the National Museum in Belgrade. So, we can now assert with certainty that what we have in front of us are copies of Mondrian paintings done by some unknown author. And we must also not lose sight of the possibility that they could have been done by several authors. However, if we take into account that on the pictures themselves there are only the painter's initials and that there is no other data which could give us information as to who the real author is, then we must conclude that the answer, who is the author of these paintings, remains unknown. Now, if we can't answer the question, who has done these pictures, isn't it at least possible to answer the question, when did they originate? We have seen that the signature on these pictures does not necessarily point to the real author. And you can therefore understand why the dates, that is, the years on them, do not necessarily have to correspond to the actual date of origin. If the years 1963 or 1979 might still seem possible as dates of origin, what can we say about these two pictures, dated 1992 and 1996? I don't know if it makes sense to say this picture originated in 1996 or that it will originate in 1996. It's now already evident that the dating on these pictures can't be taken either as a reliable indicator of their time of origin. Thus, also left unanswered is the question, when did these paintings originate? If we don't know who did these pictures and when, would it not at least be possible to find an answer to the question, why have these pictures been made? Yes, why have they been made? We have already established very credibly that these paintings were not done by Mondrian himself. On the other hand, we do know that they correspond to pictures which Mondrian painted during his lifetime. This means that the pictures in front of us are some kind of copy. But why should someone copy Mondrian? We know that copying is not unknown in artistic tradition. One can still somehow understand copying the great masters of art to acquire artistic skills. But how could anyone imagine that by copying Mondrian, they could acquire such artistic skills? I'd hardly believe it was possible. Apart from this, if we look carefully at these copies, we will see that they certainly don't radiate artistic perfection. The author of these pictures seems to be completely untalented, so the reasons for their existence must be looked for elsewhere. And I think we can assume that the acquisition of painterly perfection is not the reason for their existence. Secondly, I think a reason understandable to all of us for copying Mondrian would be, it's clear why. Mondrian's paintings have acquired such value today that it might not be a bad idea to sell someone a copy instead of an original. However, as it is well known that copies made for the purposes of forgery can only with difficulty be detected through superficial analysis, it is clear why, on the basis of the dates on these pictures alone, that we can freely dismiss this possibility. In addition, we have already ascertained that these aren't really such perfect copies as could be used for the purposes of forgery. So, if these pictures did not originate for the purposes of acquiring artistic skills and were not made for the purposes of forgery, what then was the real purpose of their creation? After all, copying pictures such as Mondrian's in a way which shows that they are unambiguously copies seems completely senseless, especially because we know that in modern art, copying is not regarded as a particular virtue. Modern art does, in fact, insist on originality, authenticity, creativity. Being a modern artist means being new, unrepeatable, different from the rest. And copying is working directly contrary to this. Copying is a synonym for uncreativity, unoriginality, unimaginativeness. To say of some artist that he reminds us just a little of some other artist is tantamount to insulting him, especially if it's a question of direct copying. And that's completely understandable, because copying does represent a completely uninventive procedure. First, there exists the painting, which is chosen as a model. Then, within the limits of the possibility of the person who is doing the copy, the formal characteristics of the model are repeated. In this way, we will get a painting which is called a copy, while the model on which it is made is called an original. For pictures such as Mondrian's, this isn't such a big problem. But why, then, were these pictures created? Isn't it, in fact, extremely illogical to make copies of such simple paintings and such a well-known artist as Mondrian? If I had to answer this question, my answer would be in the affirmative. Yes, it's extremely illogical to even think of copying Mondrian. So what now? It looks as though we've reached the end of reason or the end of understanding, because I don't know how it will be possible to talk sensibly about the results of such a senseless procedure. Or perhaps it would be possible. Could we, for example, suppose that it is this very senselessness, this nonsense, that is the sense of the creation of these pictures? I ask myself, though, whether that solves anything at all. Is it then possible to say anything else about these pictures? Let's assume for a moment that, as an exercise, that senselessness was indeed the reason for their creation. Let us take this picture as an example. It's a copy of the Mondrian picture in the National Museum in Belgrade. We can see it every day when the museum is open. I'm sure that many of you who've had the chance to visit the museum will have noticed that it differs quite a lot from the other works exhibited in the same room. Let us now suppose that this copy is exhibited in the same museum, but in a room which corresponds to the period when these pictures appeared in public for the first time, because we have seen that we cannot rely on the dating of these pictures. This means that this picture would be displayed together with those originating from the 1980s. And so one nice sunny day we set out for the National Museum. And if that day doesn't happen to be a Monday and we arrive at a time when the museum is open, we will have the chance to look at its rich collection from prehistory to the present day. We will see some of the great names of modern art: Gauguin, Monet, Renoir, Matisse, Picasso, and of course we'll notice our Mondrian. And now, carried away by curiosity,